So, hello everyone, welcome in, or if you are new, welcome back to the Mindfulness Podcast series. We have a special guest here with us today, Mr. Justin Patterson. Hi, Justin. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, Veronica, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Today, we are going to talk about how to create community and positive culture in the workplace. So I will start with you. Justin, can you tell us a little bit more about your business and what you do? I know that you work for Your Pie that's your
Yeah.
company.
Yeah, no, so I'm the vice president of operations for a franchise brand called Your Pie. We're a fast casual pizza concept. And I've been in this role for rounding on a year and a half. But prior to that, I was actually a multi-unit franchisee with Your Pie for a little over 7 years. So had the privilege of operating three restaurants and employing hundreds of teenagers over the course of those years. And that was ultimately what led me to the position I'm in now.
Wonderful. What would you say was your favorite part about that job and working with, you mentioned that you work with a lot of teens. Is that your preferred age group to work with, or?
I think it comes with the territory of owning a fast casual restaurant. I think for me, one of the most enjoyable aspects of what I did day in and day out was just mentoring employees. And so, where I tended to have the most fulfillment in my role was when I could see that I was making a difference in the lives of my employees, whether it be just teaching them how to work hard or giving them life advice. Much more than the daily grind of just making pizzas and opening and closing a restaurant. Right, a lot of the enjoyment and fulfillment really came through pouring into my people.
I love that. Do you feel like there's a difference between mentoring and creating culture with the younger demographic of people than with people your own age or older adults, or is it kind of the same process?
It's not the exact same process. I would say it actually differs person to person, not just demographically in terms of age, but um, similar to managing folks, you have to manage employees differently, right? Because everyone has a different personality and people have different motivators and what maybe I'm able to connect with one employee one way and totally different way with another employee. So, I think part of pouring into and part of creating that mentorship relationship is really just being personable with your employees, getting to know them, showing them that you care. And that's going to look different for each employee that you have.
That makes sense. So getting to know the person as an individual, that way they know that you care about them as a person and not they're not just another warm body in your store. They're a part of
Right.
the family and that they're valued.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely.
What would you say is the biggest challenge that you face in creating that culture in the workplace? And then I guess I should backpedal, but how would you define culture within your workplace?
That's a great question. So, it's funny in preparation for this conversation, I went back and watched a a webinar that I did about a year ago with a lot of our franchisee community, and I found myself quoting David Friedman, who's the author of Culture by Design. And so this was a book that I read, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's trying to be intentional about creating a healthy culture. But again, the book's called Culture by Design, and the whole first part of the book, David Friedman tries to tackle that specific question of like, well, how do you define culture? Because culture is a buzzword that people like to throw around, but people have a hard time actually, defining what it is. And so you can have all of the slogans and mission statements that do their best to try to define culture, but the way that Friedman in his book explains it, he says, when you start at a new job and you go through an orientation process and they tell you, this is what it's like, this is what our culture's like, this is what we care about. He's like, that's nice and all. He said, but it's really when you make it to lunch and you're in the cafeteria and you see that, seasoned employee who's been there for years. You go up to him and you say, hey, what's it really like to work here? How they answer that question is really what the culture of that business is like. And so I just thought that was a great, like, tangible way to define like what is culture is. It's, for somebody who's worked there for a while, like, how would they describe what it is like to work at that place? Um, so I always like that definition.
Yeah, just like an unbiased definition from the employee's perspective.
Yeah, yeah, and like culture, to me, if I had to try to put my own label on it, it's a measurement of like the health of the environment. Um, because oftentimes we like to think about culture and we immediately think like, well, how good of an environment it is. Well, it can go the other way too, right? An unhealthy culture is going to show you just how bad of an environment it is, whether it's a restaurant or any place that you work.
So trying to facilitate an environment that's conducive to personal growth and development. Or,
Yeah,
well, I like that you mentioned to keep in mind the employee's perspective, because I think sometimes a lot of us will think about workplace culture and it's such a top-down idea or ideal that the perspective of everyone else involved in creating that culture isn't looked at, if that makes
right.
sense.
And it's interesting. So, one way that I would piggyback off that is, I do think when we talk about top down, it's extremely important that the highest levels of leadership in an organization um, demonstrate like the desired culture, right? And so, never gonna have a healthy culture if you have an unhealthy leader. But then when you talk about like, well, how can a organization make sure that they have a healthy culture and continue to maintain a healthy culture? A big piece of that is actually like the selection process in a candidate.
Mm.
And I think that kind of goes to what you were speaking of a minute ago of making sure that there's input throughout the whole organization into that culture. Well, I would say it's important that you don't hire someone into your organization that's not going to be aligned with what the culture that you want in that organization, because then it's never going to be a fit, right? You're not going to be able to hire someone in who has a completely different set of core values, right? And get them to assimilate to your culture. That's fairly unlikely, right? And so the better approach is to make sure on the front end, like, hey, here's what we're about at this company, at this organization. Like, do we have alignment here? So I think in the hiring process, candidate selection is a really big piece of the culture equation.
I like that. Yeah, that directly feeds into the question that I was going to ask you next, is that do you believe that a positive workplace culture creates job satisfaction?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's everything to job satisfaction. And I think it really is a game changer in perspective, right? So when you think about, I've used this analogy or this example a number of times with franchisees and with even with managers back, like my frontline managers in my years of owning restaurants, to say, how we as leaders, like how we lead is going to greatly impact the perspective of those who we're managing. And so, like, I'll just give you a restaurant specific example. Like, if you go through a really busy shift and it's chaotic and it's hectic, if the manager on duty takes the mentality of like, that was brutal, I can't wait to get out of here, like I'm sick of this, right? Everyone else working there is going to feel that same energy, and they're going to start to see through the same lens of like, "Yeah, that was terrible. Like, this was not fun at all. Like, I don't enjoy this job. This is not, conversely, you might go through a really challenging shift. And if that same manager takes the approach of, man, we did fantastic there, guys. Like, we made it through a really, chaotic shift. But I'm proud of the way that you guys handled yourselves. You know, there's such a change in perspective with those who you're managing. And I think, that kind of goes to um, employee satisfaction. And the question you were asking about is like, you can have pretty similar underlying work conditions, but how healthy or unhealthy the culture is will greatly dictate, whether or not those employees working in those conditions um, feel fulfilled in what they're doing, or feel like they have satisfaction in their job. So a lot of it does come back to the leadership at hand and how healthy or unhealthy the culture is.
That's perfect. Yeah, because we leaders can lead the rest of the team by example. So if you see that your manager can have a positive perspective, sometimes that's all it takes to show someone there's an alternative way to look at a situation.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
And what are some of the things that you're currently implementing to facilitate positive culture in the workplace? Or what are some of the things that you would love to implement in your workplace?
Yeah. No, I'll tell you something I've got my team working on right now. So just to set the scene a little bit, right? So I work on the franchisor side, and I have a team underneath me that works to support franchisees and stores. And so a resource we're working on right now that I think will be impactful in building culture in the restaurants is a essentially a resource to aid in pre-shift meetings. And so something I had a lot of success with as a franchisee is that at the start of every single shift, whether it was a lunch shift or a dinner shift, we pull the whole team together and we would do a real quick pre-shift meeting or huddle, if you will. And it's really just to kind of set expectations, check in on everybody quickly, give them their positions for that shift, let them know of any key information that they need to be aware of. And usually this is pretty short. It could be anywhere from short as 2 minutes or as long as, let's say, 5 minutes. Um, but one of the things that I started every one of those pre-shift meetings was focusing on, we would call it our fundamental of the week. And so we as a brand established a list of core fundamentals. There's really something that we stole from the Culture by Design book, which stole it from the Ritz Carlton, right? The Ritz Carlton hotel chain. This is where this concept kind of was first founded. But essentially, it's a company adopting a list of fundamentals or behaviors that they want to just ingrain in their culture. And so we developed, as a brand, we developed our own set, and we called it the Your Pie Way. And as a franchisee, I would focus on that every single shift, right? So whatever the fundamental of the week was. So my staffs at my three restaurants, primarily teenage age folks, were hearing these fundamentals at the start of every single shift. And I think that made a big impact in the culture of our restaurants. And so that's something I'm trying to kind of codify and put into place across the whole franchise system right now. So we're working on a resource that gives uh, frontline managers like, here's a little index card, and here's essentially the fundamental you should talk about in your pre-shift meeting. Here's a best practice as it relates to operations at a your pie. Short little content. So just to kind of help to facilitate that pre-shift meeting for them, and also to create that repetition. So every single, when we actually, launch this new resource, the expectation will be that at every single year pie, every single day, they'll be talking about the same fundamental across our whole system, and the same best practice. And I think that's going to go a long ways to build culture.
Implementing those best practices and making sure that everyone's aware of them. And then at the same time, you mentioned perspective and keeping that environment positive. What
Mhm.
what are some of the hesitations that you've noticed when it comes to trying to implement uh, positive culture in the workplace? Like, um, and then how did you mitigate that? Like, if there are teenagers coming in saying, "Oh, this is just another job. I can't, I'm not going to be anywhere. I'm not going to have any growth opportunity the next 5 to 10 years. I feel like my supervisor doesn't hear me." Like, how do you work around that or
Yeah.
work through it?
Yeah. Well, a couple things there. I mean, first, it takes effort. I mean, look, the franchisees, business owners, frontline managers, like, they're busy, and um, it's not always the easiest thing to set aside time to have these personal interactions. But I always say that, and this is a concept from Friedman in his book, but culture is always forming in your business, whether you're being intentional about it or not, right? So even if you're not putting effort in, like, heads up, culture's forming, and it may be bad culture, right? And so um with that in mind, it's like we have to set aside the time and the effort to be intentional about culture. So the resistance I might get from a business owner is like, oh, I don't have time to connect with every single one of my employees, right? I don't have time to do like team building events, or so oftentimes it's going to be a time and an effort excuse. I would conversely argue back to, like, hey, you can't afford not to. But then more on the team member side, like, sometimes the resistance from a team member of, like, hey, this is just another job. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to participate in this. Oftentimes, like, those resistances can be broken down by just creating that personal connection, right? I often say, like, people don't work for businesses, right? They work for people. So, like, during my ownership tenure, like, people didn't come and work at your pie, like, especially like my frontline managers that I would spend the most amount of time with. Like, they didn't come to work at your pie because they just had a great affinity for your pie, right? They came to work for me because they had a relationship there, right? I had spent time investing in them. I think that's really true of almost any healthy culture environment. Like, people are working for their direct supervisor. Seldom ever will somebody work underneath someone that they really dislike, or they're having a bad experience underneath, and just keep working there because I'm working for company XYZ. It's like, no, people work for people, not the businesses as much. So I think just developing those relationships goes a long way in fighting resistance to being a part and aligning with the culture that you want.
I really like that. That's so huge that if people are coming to your workplace because of the people and the environment, it means that they're also likely to leave because of the people and the environment. So if you've got a culture where it's positive, people know that you value having a connection with them, you care about how they're doing, like on a, like on a deeper level at the end of the day, just beyond like how many sales did your store get? Like out when they go home that you um that that they matter.
Right.
Um and yeah, I like the way that you describe it as kind of like a family, which makes sense. I hear a lot of successful business owners parrot the same thing, that we spend most of our lives at work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think, if you ever think that your employees are going to care deeply about, the financial metrics, you're kidding yourself, So if you think, well, we have a, not great culture, but hey, we had great sales today, like your team is not going to
oh,
resonate with that.
I like that. Yeah, if like you don't have great culture, but you had great sales today, like being the key word, because how long is that going to last? But then if you're training your managers that, hey, we want to invest our time in these kids to create that culture, then they want to invest their time working for you and doing their best for the company. Like,
For sure. Yeah, and I think, the common tendency for folks is to think purely about labor or employees when they think about culture. I think it's less common for people to think about, the impact it can have on like top line revenues in your business, because at the end of the day, like your culture permeates into the guest experience, right? So even if you're not in the restaurant world, obviously it's easy for me to talk about the restaurant world. But people want to do business with a healthy culture environment, and they can sense it, whether it's like the vibe in the restaurant and they walk in and like how are they greeted, does the team look like they want to be there, um, or any non-restaurant industry. So you could just tell when you do business somewhere if it's a really unhealthy culture. You sense that.
yeah, it's true. And then it determines whether or not the customer wants to come back, and in so many ways more than in so many different types of relationships, like the workplace relationship, your relationship with your spouse, restaurants. I work with a lot of life coaches too. I'm myself am a life coach, and so much of whether or not you have a repeat customer or whether or not you stay in a relationship with someone is based on your experience.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I wanted to ask you, if you could leave the audience with one takeaway about the importance of creating positive culture in the workplace and community, what would it be?
It's a great question. Yeah, if you are a business owner, if you are a manager, um, I would reference back to my earlier quote from David Friedman's Culture by Design, is that, absent intentional effort, culture is still forming, right? And so like you've got to be intentional about creating the kind of culture that you want in your business, and you just simply can't afford not to. Um, so I certainly would leave that bit of advice, but then um, I also think that just if even if you're not a business owner, you're not a manager, wherever you work or wherever you interact in your community, like just be loving and kind to other people. Uh, I mean, at the end of the day, like you know, cared for people, care for others, and just be good to your fellow brothers and sisters, and it goes a long ways in creating healthy community and healthy culture.
Thank you. I love that. That's we always hear the saying hurt people, and then sometimes we
Mm,
forget that the reciprocal is true. Like when you're kind and you're loving, that's what you attract back to you. And sometimes you filling up someone else's cup can remind them of what it feels like, you know, to be able
absolutely,
to, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I heard just randomly, I think it was this morning, I saw a clip of Jeff Foxworthy talking, and he was referencing a conversation he once had with Truett Cathy. Truett Cathy's the founder of Chick-fil-A, and Truett Cathy, just in kind of his jovial way, was like, Jeff, you know how much it costs to give somebody encouragement? Nothing. He's like, it's free and it's the best gift. And he's like, I try to encourage people everywhere, and that just kind of stuck with me today. So it's really good advice. So
That's pretty powerful on its own.
yeah,
Um, but I did want to ask you another question too. What would you say is the most, and I know you answered this before, but for the cast, what would you say is the most rewarding part of your job?
I think most rewarding part of my job is working with others and pouring into people. It's certainly not on the analytical metrics. It's not on increasing sales, but I find fulfillment in pouring into others and mentoring others and helping them be successful. I think that's what is really fulfilling for me.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Justin, so much for coming on the show today and sharing your wisdom with us on creating positive culture in the workplace. I know you have a podcast that you're doing right now. Hopefully it just continues to grow so you can be a blessing to people that work for your company and those outside of your company. And thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the next episode. Bye, guys.